Hello and welcome to the next episode of Central Asian University Podcasts. Today we have a special guest, psychoanalyst and an author of two very influential books. We have Erica Komisar.
Brain is very plastic. It has an incredible ability to grow, but only if the environment is right.
After the age of 3, institutionalization of kids begins, right? So it's first primary school, secondary school, high school, then the university, which also falls into that period.
At least in America, a lot of confusion where parents feel that involvement is over-involvement, meaning, because there's this term helicopter parents and snowplow parents and all these terms that imply that if you're too involved, you're intrusive.
So it's very important to build secure attachment,
yes.
Right?
2 of the attachment disorders are what I call defensive strategies, which is so the child may cycle through slapping the mother and saying, I hate you, or turning away from the mother, or clinging to the mother and then cycling through and slapping the mother again. It's sort of almost like gears that can't find their groove. That's a disorganized attachment disorder.
In Uzbekistan as well, mother is the primary caregiver and kids spend most of their time with moms.
Breaking news, breaking news.
Yep.
Men and women are different.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of Central Asian University Podcasts. Today in our studio we have a special guest, a psychoanalyst and an author of two very influential books in the area of early childhood psychology and teenage psychology. We have Erica Komisar. Erica, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. How are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
Excellent. Not bad. Erica, we know that you're doing a lot of work in the area of upbringing children and the role of parenting, especially in terms of how they work. And you have 2 books which are very influential and very popular. And you especially concentrate on 2 age groups, right? From 0 to 3 and then from 9 to 25. Mm-hmm. That's how you define adolescence, right? From 9 to 25. But what made you from the very beginning focus on those 2 age groups? Where did you see the problem? Why are those 2 age groups so important and so crucial?
Well, from a neuroscience perspective, those 2 age groups are what we call the 2 critical periods of right brain development. Mm-hmm. And the right brain is responsible for important things like emotional regulation and stress regulation and the ability to read social cues, to control your impulses, to determine whether you have good enough judgment, executive functioning. These are all things that live in the right brain. And so when we're born, we're actually born only with 25% of our brain developed. And so from 0 to 3, by 3 years of age, 85% of your right brain is developed. And so what that means is that the environment in this critical period, we call it a critical period because it means that the brain is very plastic. Mm-hmm. It has an incredible ability to grow, but only if the environment is right. And the environment from 0 to 3 is usually a primary attachment figure, usually the mother. Sometimes today can be the father. But the idea is that the person who is primarily responsible, the father of attachment security and the whole theory of attachment said that the primary attachment figure is the person who's there primarily throughout the day to soothe the baby when they're in distress. So that first 3 years and that 85% of the right brain development, the presence of a parent, primarily the attachment figure, the primary attachment figure, physically and emotionally, is very important. The second critical period of brain development, so if we say the first period of development is something called neurogenesis, so we have a lot of cell growth. So imagine going from 25% to 85% in just 3 years. And then think of a garden, right? So you plant your garden and your garden grows, it overgrows. You need to cut back your bushes. And so that pruning period is the period of adolescence. So we have an overgrown garden. And then from 9 to 25, which is quite a long period of time, it's a pruning period. So the brain is, again, very plastic, very influenced by the environment. And so in these two critical periods of brain development, the brain is very sensitive to the environment. Now, in the first 3 years, the environment is the parents, really. In adolescence, it's a little more complicated. The parents are still a very important part of the environment, but now children have school and they have friends and they have social media. And so, it's very important if you can be there in that first 3 years to create that foundation for them. So when they head into adolescence, they have that foundation. So I always like to think of it we have a fable in America, the three little pigs, right?
Yeah.
So the one that builds the house of clay, of
Straw,
wood, and then brick.
Stone, yeah.
And so what we know is that the house that's built of brick doesn't blow down when the storm comes. The house that's built of straw blows down at the first sign of a storm. So what we know is that if you want to make sure that your child is reinforced for adolescence, which is adolescence is in itself an adversity. And we don't talk about that, but adolescence is a very hard time for children. And it is, even if everything goes well, an adversity. And so you want to make sure that you've shored them up in those early years and created what we call emotional security or attachment security. So when they're going into adolescence, they have a foundation to then cope with stress and to cope with adversity. And so they are less likely to break down. But that's why the two critical periods. We didn't really understand adolescence until the field of neuroscience really showed us with technology, things like fMRIs, where we could actually see that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's responsible ultimately for emotional regulation and coping with stress and adversity, that part of the brain doesn't fully develop in girls till about 25. And in boys, I would say even 27.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can see through technology things that we always assumed, but now we know to be true, that plastic period of brain development goes as long as in boys up to 27.
Up to 27. But brain plasticity obviously is always with us, right? It's just after that period of time, it becomes less kind of prevalent. So it's more difficult to introduce any sort of behavioral changes, right?
So I was trained as a Freudian psychoanalyst. I don't practice strictly as a Freudian. I'm more eclectic in my approach. But Freud used to say that he didn't want to treat patients over the age of 40 because essentially he didn't know this. He didn't have the technology, but he felt there wasn't as much plasticity in a person, that their personalities were fixed. We know now that that's not true.
It's not true, yeah.
But it is harder. Once you pass through that window, once you're out of that window of 25, 27, it becomes harder to really build in things like emotional security, the ability to cope with stress, and all of those correlations of mental health issues that go with things like attachment disorders, if you haven't been present enough. Those kind of are stickier if you haven't gotten to them early. So I never
later in life.
Yeah, I never say to parents there's no hope, because that's not what I believe, and I'm a psychoanalyst who treats adults, and therefore there's always hope. But the truth is that those are critical periods of brain development for a reason. There's a reason we call them the two periods of critical brain development.
Mm-hmm. And after the age of 3, institutionalization of kids begins, right? So it's first primary school, secondary school, high school, then the university, which also falls into that period. And this is where kids are basically exposed to society and they get less engaged with their families. Mm. But what is the role of parenting within that period? How should parents treat these institutions? Let's say, how should they communicate with those institutions to still remain attached and to help their kids go through those critical periods, especially in adolescence? I mean, my kids are now young adolescents, and I know that they are going through a stressful period in their life. So what's the role of parents in that institutional framework?
So, I mean, what's interesting is that there's a lot of confusion, I think, about involvement, at least in America, a lot of confusion where parents feel that involvement is over-involvement, meaning, because there's this term helicopter parents and snowplow parents and all these terms that imply that if you're too involved, you're intrusive. And so there's a big difference between being involved and being intrusive, or being involved and being anxious. So anxious parents are usually intrusive parents. But involved parents, we always want involved parents. So, but the biggest involvement is to be involved with your children outside of school hours. So if you are not present enough for your children throughout childhood, not just in the 2 windows of critical brain development, but also from, everybody asks me, you wrote these 2 books, what about 3 to 9? And I'm like, that's also a very important, maybe that's another book. Freud called that period sort of the latency period, but it isn't latent at all. There's a tremendous amount that's going on. But, the idea is you have to be physically and emotionally present for your children as much as you possibly can be. It doesn't mean we should all quit our jobs and stay home with our children full time. Somebody's got to work and earn a living. But is it better for children to have at least one parent who is more or less primarily, or at least mostly, around for them when they're around? Once children go to school, they go to school for 6 to 8 hours a day, don't they? And so that gives you quite a long time to work. So if we don't overvalue work, then we can work and have children. But when we start to overvalue work and material success over our children, then we abandon our children, essentially, leaving them to all of the influences in the environment and all the vices that are really doing a lot of damage to them now, right? And again, if you don't build that if you don't build that house of bricks, which is your presence, then that house isn't going to withstand the adversity of just regular old adolescence.
And this is the thing, right? So with social media, technology, all of these things, it's not just kids who are preoccupied with that, but it's also parents who spend more time on their gadgets rather than devoting time.
Do what I say, not what I do. The expression, do what I say, not what I do.
But it's very important, right, to spend time with children
and not be on your computer and your phone and not be on social media. You can't tell your children to get off social media if you're scrolling through social media yourself. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, if you can't get off your phone, or, if you're walking and talking with your children and your phone is interrupting you every 5 minutes and you pick it up while you're talking to your children, you have to understand that's not presence, right?
Yeah.
And maybe your parents did that to you in one way or another. But the idea is that when you're with your children, you put your phone, your computer, your iPads, you put them away. So they're not interrupting and interfering with that process of connection. So otherwise, children experience it as disconnection, right? So in some ways, when you're driving on the highway, you have the passing lane. It's the dotted line.
Yeah.
And then you have the straight line, which is you can't pass, right?
Yeah.
And then you have streets with no lines. In some ways, a dotted line is actually more destructive to children than a straight line or no line. Now, I'm not telling everybody to abandon their children, but the crazy-making part for children is when their parents are in and out, in and out, in and out. And even when children are really little, in 0 to 3, that window, I tell parents, once out, once in. If you can help it. Sometimes you can't help it, right? But the idea that you should spend as little time away as you can, given your work, given your situation, and that when you go out, then you come back and you don't go out again. And so parents are used to this fluidity where children are almost like pets, but not even like dogs, like cats, right? One of the reasons I'm an animal lover. So I love all animals. My son has a cat, so I have nothing against cats. But you can leave cats. Actually, you can't leave cats for that long either. But you can leave cats for longer. They're independent. You can go out. You can come in. You can go out. The cat will still come and welcome you, but won't ever cuddle up with you. The dog will start to be offended by your lack of presence. But I think people treat children today, parents treat children like pets. More than children, more than human beings. And to be honest, I have a dog and love it. And and I can't treat my dog that way either, right? So the concept is the sensitivity to understand that you are the entire universe of your child from 0 to 3. You are their entire world and universe.
It's an integral part.
When you leave, they have lost. It's not for you. It's just, oops, I'm out. For them, it's their entire universe that they've lost. And there's no sensitivity to that, really. We've been desensitized to believe that, any old caregiver will do, and my in and out, and it's fine. And so the insensitivity, I find that is sort of that's what's happened to parenting, if I was to say that there's been an increasing insensitivity about children.
There's a continuity, right? So this time should not be broken into there shouldn't be any breaks. You're there with them.
Or you have the sensitivity to understand that when you go out, you say goodbye. You don't leave without saying goodbye. Never never sneak out with your young children. And you promise them that you'll come back, and you come back when you promise them you'll come back. And you don't, you sacrifice. In other words, dinner engagements and business dinners. When you have young children, whether you're a mother or father, whether you're working or not, that idea that your life will never change and that you can just go back to business as usual after you have a baby is false. It's a false narrative. And if you try to do that, then you'll end up doing harm to your children, which inevitably ends up doing harm to you, because I've never known a happy parent who's got an unhealthy child, right? We say you're only as happy as your least healthy child. So your happiness is contingent on their happiness. It may not seem so in the years when you are narcissistically pursuing your own thing, but your happiness ultimately is contingent upon their happiness.
Yeah. And it's this theory of attachment, right? You can have secure attachment, avoidance, etc. So it's very important to build secure attachment, right?
Yes.
And what if, because obviously there are various situations, and some kids might develop different types of attachments to their parents, like avoidance or I don't know.
Well, we call them attachment disorders because it's basically pathological defenses to cope with the absence of their parents.
Absence of significant or not even secure figure.
Right.
But in the later stages of their lives, how does that manifest? What harm are we doing to the society if we negligently behaving like that?
Well, two of the attachment disorders are what I call defensive strategies. So avoidant attachment disorder and ambivalent attachment disorder are both defensive strategies. So meaning a child has a strategy to cope with either the physical and or emotional absence of a parent. I mean, you can be there physically and be emotionally checked out. You cannot be there emotionally if you're not there physically, right? So you understand that. Yeah. But there are some parents who are stay-at-home parents or who spend a lot of time with their kids, who sit down and watch television and read the newspaper and ignore their children. So we say there is absent too, right? But the concept is you have to think about it as attachment security is something that it is a strategy. So for children, secure attachment is a strategy, right? Mm-hmm. So are those two attachment disorders. They have strategies. The third attachment disorder is without a strategy. And what I mean by that is the third attachment disorder is a child who lacks a strategy and cycles through all of the other attachment disorders. And so it's called disorganized attachment disorder. And so instead of an avoidant attachment disorder where a child's response to the absence is to turn away.
Yeah.
And say, I don't need you. You're not there for me anyway. I'm just going to have to manage on my own. I don't need you. And it's what we call defensive independence, right? Or what we call detachment, really. That's a strategy. Ambivalent is anxious attachment. It's when a child says, oh my God, my parent's going to leave again, and grabs on for dear life to that parent and cries desperately for that parent not to leave. And you see this sometimes when children are put in preschool too early or in daycare. You see a child develop clinging strategies, almost like the rhesus monkey experiments that were done, right? Just grasping on to the wire monkey mommy.
Yeah.
Because they know the mommy's going to leave again. So they become inconsolable. They become, desperately clingy, right? Again, a strategy. disorganized attachment disorders, and the child ends up kind of cycling through turning away, then becoming anxious and clinging. But then there's a rage component, which is so the child may cycle through slapping the mother and saying, I hate you, or turning away from the mother, or clinging to the mother, and then cycling through and slapping the mother again. So it's sort of like almost like gears that can't find their groove. That's a disorganized attachment disorder. And so what we say is that disorganized attachment disorders are most closely correlated with personality disorders later on, whereas avoidant attachment disorders are more closely associated with depression later on, and ambivalent attachment disorders with anxiety and ADHD later on. So you have these correlates in mental illness with all of these attachment disorders. So you'd say that the foundation of security, which is protective for a child against mental illness, particularly if a child is emotionally or neurologically sensitive, as many, many children are today, that foundation is not securely created or fostered in that child, right? Because you weren't present enough. And so that child then develops these mental illness correlates later on.
And is it passed from generation to generation? Because if
It
I
is.
had, for example, a trauma, then not a trauma, but
It is. There is
So it
generational transmission, yeah.
generation transmission of that.
Yeah. So a borderline mother is more likely to produce a borderline child. A depressed mother is more likely to produce a depressed child. And an anxious mother more likely to produce an anxious child. That doesn't mean there's no hope, right? So that cycle can be interrupted at any point, right? Either by the mother or by the child, but you have to get professional help. It doesn't just go away on its own.
So it's difficult for parents to do it themselves when they realize, for example, oh, what am I doing?
No. No one can fully examine themselves. It's an interesting thing. It's like looking in a mirror. No one can fully see their own reflection without some help, because it's a subjective experience rather than an objective experience. So I'm an analyst. If you go to just a regular old counselor who maybe is a little bit less well-trained and also is trained to just soothe a person, and that means all they do is mirror the person, that person may not provide ultimately that patient with an objective experience of themselves so they can make changes in themselves. Yes, it's soothing to go to that kind of counselor who just says, I see that's terrible. I'm so sorry. And again, I do that too. You do that as a warm-up. But then you want to really help people to take responsibility and see themselves fully. But if you're looking in a mirror and you're not getting help, you can't fully see yourself.
Yeah, and these are profound changes that should actually happen, right?
Right.
Not just in terms of yourself, but in terms of relationship with your child.
Yeah.
Speaking about that, the role of fathers in the early childhood, because we have basically normally, well, in Uzbekistan as well, mother is the primary caregiver, and kids spend most of their time with moms, and fathers normally work, but then they come home. What's the role of the father? Well, in all of those stages, actually, how should we behave and how should we be there, basically?
Well, I mean, what's interesting is that a lot of the traditional roles of fathers and the traditional roles of mothers weren't just societal. They weren't just social constructs, contrary to popular belief. They had evolutionary grounding, meaning that they were biologically wired into us as mammals. A lot of the role of fathers as protectors of their families, providers and protectors, was biologically wired into fathers. A lot of the role of what we call sensitive empathic nurturing was wired into mothers. So there was some research done in the UK where mothers and fathers lay in bed and the baby cries, and the mother wakes vigilantly immediately to the baby's cries, and the father sleeps through the baby's cries every time. But when there's a rustling of leaves outside the window, the father wakes up and the mother sleeps through it. So we are wired in these ways. It is not a societal construct. That is a misunderstanding of how these behaviors were formed, because our nurturing behaviors as human beings are connected to our hormones. Our hormones have dictated our nurturing behaviors for years. Now, things like toxic masculinity or powerless women. I mean, those might be societal constructs, meaning taking advantage of biological wiring.
The extremes.
Yeah, the extremes. But the actual behaviors, they're associated with nurturing hormones. And so men and women, this is going to be a shocker to anybody listening, are actually different. Yeah, big shocker.
Really?
Yeah, I know, right? Breaking news. Men and women are different. They also are equal in intelligence, and they're equal in capability of doing many jobs. But I think the concept of equal but different is not a concept we embrace. We want to say equal and the same. I'm not sure why we want to believe that we're exactly the same, because it destroys the beauty of being different.
Mm-hmm.
It would be like if everybody's culture and religion and was stripped from them and we were all the same. Can you imagine how boring it would be? So why we would want to strip away our differences, which are actually biologically wired into us, that's a modern construct of sameness, trying to strip away the differences. The differences have incredible meaning in the raising of children. And as I said, fathers being protective and providing, there's a reason for that, because in the early years, children need a primary attachment figure as present as possible. That doesn't mean mothers can't work. It means as present as possible. It means that child is a priority over anything else. So how can the mother manage that financially if the father isn't willing to step up and do his role to protect and provide, right? Yeah. So it's teamwork. And we've always considered raising children a team project until now, because teams don't compete with one another. Teams work in a complementary way with one another. They don't compete with one another. So we've created, as a society, as a modern society, a competition between mothers and fathers to be the same. In fact, to be mothers to be better fathers and fathers to be better mothers. And that isn't helpful to anyone, because when teams compete, it's not healthy. And when teams compete, then the team falls apart, right? And which is what divorce is about, which is what families falling apart is about, right? Instead of thinking of it as a team approach. So maybe as a father, you're protecting and providing in the years that your spouse, your wife, is raising your very young children. And maybe later, I always joke and say, when I was raising kids, my husband and I strategized. We had a deal. He was going to make most of the money. Well, I just kept my toe in my practice. I worked like an hour and a half a day, but I raised my children and our children. And now he jokes that, he wants to just sit and read books and retire, and I'm going to provide for him now. And I'm like, I'm fine with that, because I'm going to work till I die, right? Or until I lose my mind, which is hopefully like 100. So, so there's a time. It's all about timing. There's something called the marshmallow test, which is a very old test about if you offered a child one marshmallow and you said, this test. You want to tell people what the test is? Go ahead. No, tell. Okay. You offered a child a marshmallow and you said, you can have this marshmallow right now. And you say, but if you wait a few minutes, you can get 2 more marshmallows. Yeah. The kids who chose the marshmallow immediately didn't do as well in life as the kids who were able to wait for the marshmallows. So what it says is, I think there was a book in America called Everything I Needed to Learn. I learned in kindergarten. It was many, many years ago, but it was about things like sharing and waiting and things that are important life lessons Waiting is a very important one. And so the idea that we all have to have, we all have to eat it up right now, and we have to have our fabulous careers, and we all have to, be like on top of the world and have lots of stuff, and it's all got to come right, as if we're all going to die tomorrow. Instead of saying life is long and let's strategize how we can be a team and raise the healthiest children. And there will be a season in life, as the song goes. There will be a season in life for everything, for fabulous careers for both of you, for time with your family. There'll be time for everything, but you have to be able to wait for the right timing of it. And that's something that a lot of adults are not very good at. Again, that marshmallow test is a test also of impulse control. It's a right brain test, but it's a test of emotional regulation, because the kids who were asked about the marshmallows were already children who had passed through the 0 to 3 window. And whether their parents were able to help them to learn to regulate their emotions in those early years had a great deal to do with whether they chose one marshmallow or waited.
And it was a great predictor of what's going to happen to them.
It's a great predictor. Yeah. So if you can't regulate your emotions, if you can't forestall your frustration, then you don't do as well in life.
And that is to do with the emotional attachments, with
that
emotional
has to do
intelligence.
That has to do with attachment security. And as John Bowlby said, the soothing of a child from moment to moment in the first 3 years helps to regulate that child's distress, excitement, fear, sadness, anger, all of these emotions that are so important to be regulated. Even excitement needs to be regulated, right? And so if your parent isn't there to help in a calm way to balance you in the beginning, you never learn to balance yourself. You never internalize emotional regulation. And that's what depression, anxiety, attentional issues, they're all disorders of emotional regulation. We have a bunch of young adults and adults at this point running around who cannot regulate their emotions. They can't sleep. There's a big article that just came out that said insomnia is the plague of the world. Insomnia was never the plague of the world, because sleeping is part of emotional regulation too. If you can't turn off your emotions at the end of the day, it means that you never learn to regulate them throughout your life.
But it's so much stress with the social media and everything else that just, inundate you. Your brain just can't calm down. But
emotional regulation, again, dictates that so remember, in the right brain are things like judgment, impulse control. So if you didn't have that part of your brain developed with the care of your parents in those early years, then you don't have the capability of turning off your phone. You don't have the ability of putting away your devices, because the impulse control isn't there, the judgment isn't there, the executive functioning isn't there, right? So again, you have to go back to the beginning. People don't like to go back to the beginning. They say, I can't remember the beginning. I'm like, but your body remembers the beginning. Your mind remembers the beginning. You may not have conscious memory. You have unconscious memory. You are imprinted in the beginning by the behaviors and the care of your parents.
And that's when the brain is most plastic. So that's when
we call it a blueprint, right? You need a blueprint to build a building, right? The architect makes a blueprint. The blueprint for your life is in the first 3 years.
First 3 years.
And so those are the years you really want to focus on.
Erica, thank you very much. This was very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.